Everybody looks for yield first, and that's not necessarily what we do. We'll look at the disease package, what it can do for us, because a lot of times what the disease package carries for us will make up for a little bit of yield and for quality. Because for us, having that malt quality, that is what pays the bills.
Welcome to the Barley Bin. SaskBarley's goal is to take you right into the barley bin, not a hopper bin or a bin with in-floor augers, but the kind you'd spend a bit of time shoveling, getting itchy. It's worth it for the pint or steak afterwards, or a golden nugget you sometimes find uncovering itchy topics.
I'm Mitchell Japp. This season, we've been talking about disease. In episode 5, we sat down with Dr. Kelly Turkington, Dr. Randy Kutcher, and Dr. Gurcharn Brar on Fusarium head blight. What the research says about managing it, the toxins beyond dawn that markets are starting to watch, and a novel approach to finding FHB resistance hiding inside a variety growers are already growing. In episode 7, we covered the leaf diseases that don't always make the headlines: scald, netform net blotch, spot-form net blotch, spot blotch, and bacterial leaf streak, and heard a warning from Australia about what happens when fungicide resistance gets ahead of the industry. If you caught episode 4 of the season, you heard how the Prairie Recommending Committee for Oat and Barley, or PRCOB, PRCOB, evaluates new varieties before they reach the seed guide. You heard about the Disease Evaluation Subcommittee, the rating scale, the registration process, and why the system is built the way it is. Today we follow that chain all the way back to its beginning. When a barley producer opens the provincial seed guide and looks up a variety's disease resistance rating, they are looking at the end result of years of work: nurseries, lab tests, field evaluations, breeding crosses, and in some cases, wild barley. Who would imagine traits from wild barley ending up in a commercial variety grown in Saskatchewan? But we're going to trace that chain today, and we're going to ask what happens when parts of it start to break. Joining us, Dr. Kelly Turkington from the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Lacombe, Dr. Randy Kutcher from the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Gurcharn Brar from the University of Alberta, Dr. Aaron Beattie from the Crop Development Centre at the University of Saskatchewan, and Gord Moellenbeck, a barley producer near Engelfeld in East-Central Saskatchewan and a director on the SaskBarley board. Let's start where it matters most, at the farm gate. Gord Moellenbeck farms close to 2,000 acres of barley near Engelfeld in East-Central Saskatchewan, a region that gets enough moisture to make disease pressure a real and recurring reality. His goal every year is to hit malt quality on every single acre. That objective shapes how he thinks about every variety decision he makes.
Everybody looks for yield first, and that's not necessarily what we do. We'll look at the disease package, what it can do for us, because a lot of times what the disease package carries for us will make up for a little bit of yield and also for quality. Because for us, having that malt quality, that is what pays the bills. Nothing wrong if you want to grow for feed. That's a whole different, practice to do. But for us, for malting, we want to make sure that it is as disease-free as possible. And that usually will give us that little extra bump on yield, and then it's a very saleable product for us.
Good stuff. So disease ratings are a pretty high consideration for you and your farm.
Yes, very much so.
40 years of farming in a high moisture environment will teach you that lesson pretty quickly. The year that really cemented it for Gord was 2016.
Well, that particular year was the year. And we had just tried Synergy for, just to see, because this was a new and upcoming one. Everyone was pretty pumped on what it was, and it did turn out to be a good variety but it was limited in our area. And that was part of the false loose smut problem. The standability was not as good as what we wanted, but also too, given that year being as, I guess, lush growth is what it was, we had other varieties that did fall down, but not to that extent. And I think some of it, being environmental, you have to kind of take some of that, into account and grow it a couple of years. But we felt that the disease package was not strong enough in our area to warrant trying to keep growing that variety.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So we started looking on other ones, and in 2020 was our first year of growing Connect, and we were really happy with how that stood and the disease package on it.
False loose smut is a fungal disease of barley caused by Eustylago nigra. Unlike covered smut, the infected heads are replaced entirely by masses of dark spores at heading that eventually blow away in the wind. So by the time you see it in the field, there's nothing to be done. The disease can persist in seed, which is one more reason seed quality matters from the start. It is fairly uncommon now due to genetic resistance and seed treatments. Gord's experience, walking a field, seeing head after head, is the kind of thing that changes how a producer thinks about variety selection permanently, and it's exactly the kind of outcome the disease nursery system and the registration process are designed to catch before a variety reaches the marketplace. So how does a producer actually use the disease resistance ratings in the seed guide? Gord gives an overview of his thought process when he's making his variety decisions. And what would it take to move him off his current choices? If you had a variety, let's say, that was 10% higher on yield, but a little weaker on disease, where's your threshold in making those decisions?
Chances are we would go with the disease package first. 10% yield change can be taken up by having a better, healthier plant. So we will usually go with the MR rather than the MS, but also too, depending on what diseases they are, if it's some leaf disease or something that is not common for us, usually a fungicide will probably help that out, but generally we will always stick with the disease moderately resistant rather than susceptible, just for the quality issue and health of the plant.
AAC Connect currently holds the highest disease rating of the top 5 recommended malt barley varieties in the seed guide, at least on Fusarium head blight, where it is rated MR. MR is the second highest rating available. It starts at S, susceptible, to MS, moderately susceptible, I, intermediate, then on to moderately resistant, MR, that's Connect, and finally, the top rating is R, resistant. Gord has been growing AAC Connect since 2020, and he's watched most of his acres shift to it. But here's where it gets interesting. He also grows CDC Churchill alongside it, and Churchill sits as an MS for FHB. He manages that gap deliberately. We talked about how he thinks about that balance, and what it would take to adopt a variety with an R rating, one step above where AAC Connect sits now. In looking at the variety guide right now for barley, particularly on the malting side, you're growing malting on your farm, Connect has the highest disease rating of those top 5 varieties that are on the recommended list for malting barley. Mm-hmm. It's got the MR rating. If there was a variety that came out in the next couple of years and it had an R rating, how quickly would you be looking to adopt that and test it on your farm? If you could have that R level resistance to FHB or maybe one of those other top diseases that are not as strong as you'd like to see yet.
Usually when there's a newer variety that piques our interest, we will start with a small field first and then evaluate it from there um, on what we get in the end. Is if the disease package is equal to the quality in the end, um, and for a lot of people, especially in our area, because we have the rainfall standability. So we'll try and look at, like I said, the end result, and if it piques our interest enough and it checks all the boxes equal to, say, Connect, then we'll look and see what do the buyers want. Because in the end, we still have to sell a product, and it doesn't matter how good that product is. If you don't have a sale for it or a poor sale for it, then yeah, we'll just kind of wait and see what becomes of it. But some of these newer varieties that have come along, we've been growing Churchill for probably 4 or 5 years now. Yeah, good 5 years, and it really performs well, and we felt that that was a good enough variety to stick with. And you know, anybody who talks to me from Prairie Malt to Bungie knows my feelings on Churchill. It's a good variety for our growing region. It checks all the boxes that need to be checked, and it's a variety that will push. So for any new varieties coming, if they can meet or exceed any of those from Connect and Churchill, bring it on. I'll drop one.
Good stuff. So I'm curious about your thoughts on Churchill. Provincially, we've not had a fusarium pressure year province wide since 2016. So we're getting
Mhm.
quite far removed from a really severe fusarium pressure. You're seeing it in your area because you get the moisture on an
Yeah,
ongoing basis. Maybe not quite as high pressure as what it was 2012, 14, 16, those years that were really
yeah,
bad. So you've got two varieties that are kind of the opposite ends of the extreme. Your Churchill's got the MS rating for FHB, and then Connect has the MR rating. Do you have concerns that if we're going to get some more fusarium pressure and it's going to be a problem for Churchill? Or is that why you keep the balance between the Connect and the Churchill?
yeah. It's a little bit of a balancing act there, like you said. Um, we know that there can be problems with it. We've seen it in, say, for example, 21, where it was a dry year, and 21, and I think 23, no, last year was a little bit of a dry year, or 24, and it came out with not quite as plump of kernels as what you'd like to see.
Yeah, I think that was
Uh,
24.
Yeah. So it's always in the back of our mind, and we do it every year. Is this variety still strong enough for us to keep in the rotation? But what we really like about Churchill is that it really stands up to some of the chitting issues that we can have. It works very well for us. So usually we'll seed that first, because if there is chitting issues, it will happen in August.
Yep.
Because a lot of times we'll get that warm, wet, uh, 2 day, 3 day rain, and that's all what it takes to get it to sprout in the head. So it handles that very well. We're always like I said, always looking on the dawn side of things, but so far, knock on wood, it hasn't been a problem, and I'm hoping that it stays that way. But it's one of those things where all of a sudden you're going to have a dawn year and a fusarium year, and um, there's really nothing that you can do for it. We do our spraying, we do all that stuff, and if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, and we did what we can, and we'll move on from there.
Yep.
If we don't get malt out of it, we don't get malt out of it. We don't. We rely on it, but we don't pencil it in.
Chitting, the pre-germination of barley kernels in the head before harvest, is exactly the kind of quality defect that ends a malt barley sale. Churchill's resistance to it is worth something on Gord's farm that doesn't show up as a number on the disease rating page. That nuance, the gap between what a seed guide can show and what a producer learns through years of growing, is part of what makes experienced grower knowledge so valuable. But here's the question those years of experience keep circling back to. Where does the MR rating actually come from? Who ran the test? In what field? Under what conditions? And who decides what it means? That's where we're headed next. Dr. Kelly Turkington spent his career at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Centre in Lacombe, Alberta, as a plant pathologist specializing in barley leaf diseases. He appeared in episodes 5 and 7 of this season, talking about his research on FHB spray timing and the warning signs of fungicide resistance coming out of Australia. Today, Kelly is talking about the infrastructure that generated the data behind those disease ratings, the disease nurseries that have been running at Lacombe for decades. A disease nursery is not simply a plot where barley grows. It's a carefully designed system where hundreds or thousands of breeding lines and commercial varieties are grown under conditions that maximize disease pressure through artificial inoculation, strategic location, or both, so that their reaction to a specific pathogen can be reliably measured and compared. The data from those nurseries feeds into the cooperative trials of the registration system and eventually into the seed guide ratings. Gord uses those ratings on his farm every spring. Maybe do you want to talk about the disease nurseries that you run and how what you do with those nurseries feeds into the resistance ratings that the grower would see in their respective provincial seed guides?
Absolutely. So we've been running disease nurseries here, and my predecessor, Peter Burnett, unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. I took his position after he moved into the vortex of management, and Peter had brought up an approach from Icarta Cimet in Mexico. He was a pathologist there prior to coming to Lacombe, and it was the hill plot approach in terms of disease nurseries. So he started, and I need to acknowledge that, he started the Scald nurseries here at Lacombe. We had a joint Alberta-Canada barley development agreement that went from about 1993 to 2018, I think. And so that we started with the Scald nurseries. And I would say, the nursery at Lacombe was probably one of the larger ones globally. And it would ebb and flow between about 5,000-6,000 lines, upwards of 9,000, depending on the year and what other activities we were conducting.
So that's reflective of the volume of lines the breeder is looking at.
Yeah.
Early generations, and so they're getting that scald information early on and culling lines based on disease reaction.
Absolutely.
9,000 lines in a single disease nursery. That's the scale of what a working plant pathology program generates. And it has to happen every year in a location where the climate and the pathogen cooperate for the data to be meaningful. The Scald nursery is at Lacombe for a specific reason. Scald, a disease caused by Rhynchosporium siccalis, is a cool, wet weather disease. Central Alberta reliably gives it what it needs. You can't easily run a reliable Scald nursery in Saskatchewan or Manitoba because the conditions that make the disease severe don't show up consistently enough to trust the data. Just like an FHB nursery in Alberta can't fully replace an FHB nursery in southern Manitoba. Once that nursery data is generated, here's what happens to it.
So it generates that disease data that then we look at the priority 1 diseases in barley, and we look at the package of reactions. And if it's an average type of reaction, our vote is do not object. If it's above average reaction, it's typically support. And then unfortunately, if there are lines where it falls down on most of the priority 1 diseases, and especially fusarium, if you get high levels of DON, often that's when we'll recommend to object to registration. So those ratings are a key part of the merit-based evaluations of candidate lines. But the important thing downstream for producers is the fact that those ratings are taken and they go directly into the Saskatchewan variety guide for cereals, the Manitoba variety guide for cereals, the Alberta guide for cereals. And so without that co-op evaluation, and it's all a standardized process, everything is treated the same. So, we're evaluating things, I would say, as objectively as possible in terms of the reaction. And then that data is then moved into the variety guides. So a farmer is looking at trying to decide what variety to grow. And let's say disease is part of the package of concerns. Yield obviously is king. Lodging resistance can be very, very important. The type of barley you're looking at, malting or feed, are important, but disease can become an important parameter for farmers. So especially if they've struggled with some real significant problems.
That last point is worth sitting with for a minute. If you've heard episode 4 of this season, you heard Chad Ferguson describe the PRCOB, the Prairie Recommending Committee for Oat and Barley, the Disease Evaluation Subcommittee, as the hardest one to satisfy, the grumpiest of the 3 teams, in Chad's words. That reputation, it turns out, is a feature, not a bug. The nursery data is what makes it possible for that committee to do its job. Now let's hear from the person on the other side of that process, the breeder who receives the nursery data and has to figure out what to do with it. Dr. Aaron Beattie runs the barley breeding program at the Crop Development Centre at the University of Saskatchewan, the CDC. The varieties coming out of that program end up in James Tucker's nursery at Brandon and in the PERCOB registration system Kelly just described. And finally, in Gord Moellenbeck's field. Beattie is the person who receives the disease nursery data and decides what it means for which breeding lines survive. He's also the person who receives pre-breeding material from researchers like Dr. Gurcharn Brar. Brar, who worked on wild barley germplasm that you heard about in episode 7. And then Dr. Beattie has to figure out how to move the upstream genetics work into something that ends up in a commercial variety. But let's start with how the breeding program interacts with the disease testing system that feeds those seed guide ratings. When Kelly Turkington or James Tucker sends you a disease rating, what does that actually trigger in your program?
It's a good question. We start our disease testing as early as we can in our program. So probably, 3 years before anything ever makes it into registration testing, we kind of initiate disease testing to the degree that we've got seed available. So as we get that data coming in from the various nurseries that we access, that kind of goes into the pool of information that we collect on these breeding lines. So all the agronomy pieces that come in related to yield and maturity, and then all the quality data if it's a malting line, and that all sits together in one file. And so that disease data is a big piece for us. We've always emphasized disease to a pretty high degree, and I think that's in general. You could probably say the same thing for all the Western Canadian breeding programs. We've just sort of had that importance put into us from various end users and farmers alike. So we prioritize the disease data like anything else. Probably some diseases like fusarium head blight, some of the leaf diseases like scald or net blotch or spot blotch, and certainly stem rust, they would take a high priority in terms of selection of a line. So if a line is, say, lacking stem rust resistance, at least in our program, it's going to go out the door and be discarded right away. With that fusarium rating, we're probably like to see data for more than 1 year, knowing that that disease is a little bit harder to get a handle on. But if we see a couple of years where we've got some pretty poor numbers associated with that, the line's going to go out the door as well. So we try to balance that disease data with everything else that we're seeing. But if a line is really quite poor for most of the priority diseases that that we care about for registration, certainly that's going to cause it to be left behind in the program there. I think it works well. Like, I mean, if I was to take an example of that work, I mean, this year at the registration meetings, we had 2 lines that came through the registration system that for the, I don't know, one of the first times in a long time for us, maybe for me personally, the first time where we almost had unanimous support from the disease subcommittee in terms of their assessment of these 2 malt varieties. So it was almost complete support, and that kind of goes back to all the work that the pathologists sort of do for us to help us get the lines to the testing system.
Well, that's excellent. Yeah, and the support from the disease evaluation team is pretty rare. They're quite exacting in their assessments.
They are, for sure. Yeah, I know it's always a bit of a running joke that they're the grumpiest committee out of all 3 of them that work together.
If you caught episode 4, that tracks exactly with what Chad Ferguson said about the disease subcommittee. It's hard to get a full recommendation from them, and that's exactly how it's supposed to work. 3 years of disease testing before a line even enters the registration system, then 2 more years in the registration trials. That's 5 or more years of disease testing. That data feeds into the varieties and the ratings in the seed guide. And that's just the start. Most programs are testing both before and after registration. Now, how many lines is he actually managing across all of that? To appreciate how much work sits behind a single registered variety, it helps to understand the scale of what a breeding program is managing at any given time. How many lines are typically moving through your breeding pipeline at any given time? And what does disease resistance have to do with which ones survive?
So yeah, we've got, I mean, it's probably we've talked about in the past, the breeding programs kind of got materia at all these different stages, and each stage of the process has sort of vastly different numbers. So kind of on the back end of our program where we're doing replicated yield testing, probably have about 800 lines at that stage. So that's kind of our most expensive sort of stage of testing because of all this multi-location testing we do. Kind of a generation before that where we're sort of in this 1 rep yield trial stage, we typically would have maybe around 4,000 lines. And then if you move back another generation, we're probably up around 20 to 30,000 lines. So overall, you're kind of in that, 40,000 lines overall. So they don't all get tested for all diseases, but most of them will get tested for at least something. It's sort of when we've got the big numbers, it's usually 1 or 2 diseases, and then by the back end, they get tested for everything. So yeah, and like I said before, we kind of prioritize which diseases we focus on the most, which we feel are they have to have versus it's nice to have. So yeah, like I said, usually Fusarium's a big one, stem rust, and usually, we've got a few leaf diseases. We've got spot blotch, net blotch, and scald that we think about. We would like to see at least 2 of those 3 diseases having a sort of a intermediate or better, usually better level of resistance to kind of move forward with them. But again, if it's really exceptional for some other attribute, agronomics or else otherwise, we may move it along if it's just lacking a little bit, but it can't be a total bust across all diseases. They get quickly thrown out at that point.
Yeah, that's fair. I've seen examples of the breeding pipeline. It starts as a very wide funnel at the top and narrows quite rapidly because you're dealing with orders of magnitude difference between each generation.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, usually, probably most breeders from one generation to the next, they're keeping maybe 10, maybe up to 20% of the lines that they would have had in the prior year. So yeah, it scales down pretty quickly.
Yeah, breeder's biggest friend is the garbage bin.
Exactly. Yeah, you need a big one too.
40,000 lines. 800 of those reach replicated yield trials. That's a retention rate of 2%. The rest get eliminated, most of them quietly, on disease grounds or other shortcomings, before a grower ever hears the names. And of those 800, another extremely small fraction enter the registration trials and become a variety. What survives that process ends up in the registration system. And the data it generates there is what Gord opens the seed guide to read. But how solid are those numbers? So when Gord opens that seed guide and reads MR next to Connect, MS next to Churchill, what went into producing that number? Aaron Beattie has seen it from both sides. So all of this work that you're doing, it often funnels right down into a simple line in the SaskSeed guide. And so when a producer opens that SaskSeed guide and they read across and they look at the rating for FHB or scald, what went into generating that rating for those diseases from your perspective?
The ratings themselves that the growers see in the guide are coming straight out of the registration testing system. So what that means is that line has been assessed for 2 years in those within the testing system. So that can include both greenhouse and field testing in the case of many of the leaf diseases, or multiple FHB nurseries each year. So there's a lot of data that goes into coming up with that rating. It's been vetted by many pathologists as well as the committees that look at all the information that comes forward with these varieties. So it's our best assessment of these lines, and I would say they're fairly solid. I mean, over time, you do see, maybe pathogen races change over time, so that can maybe impact the rating of a given line. But for the most part, that doesn't happen for usually quite a number of years after the line's been registered. So it's a lot of data that goes into those ratings, and then even prior to that line being in the registration system, the breeder has probably had it in multiple years of disease nursery testing as well. So, we say that those numbers are based on 2 years of data, but it probably is in actuality, there's more years of data that goes into it because the breeder wouldn't have put it into the test if it wasn't carrying something, or at least they would be aware of what the ratings were probably going to be on that line. Yeah, I think growers can trust those ratings pretty solidly.
And then there's some ongoing evaluation. You mentioned James Decker continues to evaluate registered varieties for FHB, and I recall there was in the early 2010s a breakdown of one of the resistance genes for crown rust and oats, and so a bunch of the varieties that had that resistance gene that was overtaken had their ratings drop significantly.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, James is good for that. He does that assessment for FHB, also spot blotch. He keeps them in his nursery for quite a while afterwards as well. And I think Kelly also did the same thing with scald. I'm not totally sure on that one, but yeah, if there's room, these pathologists are pretty good about continuing to assess at least those varieties that are in the guide, or the ones that are maybe a little bit more commonly grown, depending on how much space they've got in the nurseries. And yeah, you're right. And that continues to happen with the crown rust and oat. We continue to see that probably every 5 to 7 years. There's sort of a downgrading of varieties as the pathogens shift there.
The system is more dynamic than you maybe realize. A rating isn't stamped on a variety at registration and fixed forever. James Tucker at Agriculture Canada's Brandon Research Centre continues to evaluate registered varieties in his FHB nursery year after year. If the pathogen population shifts, the ratings can move, as AAC Synergy and CDC Fraser both illustrate. That ongoing evaluation, running nurseries year after year on varieties already in the marketplace, is exactly the kind of work that requires dedicated people and physical infrastructure. And that infrastructure is now under threat. In the winter of 2026, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada announced the closure of several research stations across Western Canada, including Lacombe, Indian Head, and Scott. These aren't administrative offices. They're physical locations where disease nurseries ran, pathologists worked, regional adaptation trials, agronomy trials, where decades of environmental and pathogen data had been accumulated. Dr. Randy Kutcher at the University of Saskatchewan has watched these closures unfold from the perspective of someone who's collaborated with those stations for his entire career. He's also transitioning toward retirement himself, a transition that, alongside Kelly Turkington's forced early retirement, means the industry is losing expertise and infrastructure simultaneously.
So you touched on your Fusarium head blight nursery there. I was talking with Kelly Turkington about nurseries and the value of them and how they feed into the ratings for the seed guides, and each variety that goes into the seed guide has their rating for disease resistance. How important is it to have nurseries for a disease like Fusarium head blight that's so impactful on grain production and end use quality? How important is it to have those disease nurseries replicated across the prairies and actually even beyond the prairies?
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. And this is the big issue with so many of the Ag Canada sites closing that, for variety development, it's going to be really challenging to come up with enough data in enough spots that you feel confident that your varieties are going to perform at these various environments, right? So losing Indian Head, that's a big chunk of eastern Saskatchewan. We don't really, right now, as far as I know, the breeders don't really have a plan, like how are we going to test the material there, right? And same with Kelly Turkington's program at Lacombe. Not having his site will be, Kelly and I have worked closely together over my career and his career. So that's really, it's too bad. It's a loss. And for plant breeding, you're going to have to figure something else out. But who's going to do it? Who's going to pay for it? I think that those are all questions that hopefully, SaskBarley will be asking those questions and challenging the powers that be that we need these locations, these environments.
Yeah, I think it's certainly internally within SaskBarley, we recognize the importance of having these disease nurseries and these different environments. The necessity of understanding the interaction of the genetics, the environment, and the management, the G by E by M, was such a key fit that Ag Canada filled that role, and to have that's just kind of disappear in a whim, that's pretty critical, and we need to figure out how to make it work for the industry.
G by E, genotype by environment interaction. It's a technical term for something every farmer already understands intuitively. A variety that yields well in one region doesn't always translate to another. The research infrastructure that measures those interactions across multiple environments, years, and disease pressures is what gives the numbers in the seed guide their reliability. Lose the environments, and the data gets a little thinner. Aaron Beattie has been watching the same situation unfold from the breeding program side.
We know there's a lot of things up in the air, but from a perspective of them closing, what did you lose when those stations closures were announced, and does that create any gaps in your program that are going to be difficult to account for?
Yeah. So I think, there's a couple things that immediately come to mind. I mean, when you lose someone like Kelly Turkington and his staff that had been there for a while, probably the biggest thing we lose is sort of that leadership, mentorship that group offered. So, Kelly was a sort of our elder statesman as a pathologist. And I know he had plans in his mind to sort of mentor the next person who he was hoping would take over his position there. So kind of losing that's a big deal because, I mean, we all benefit from that knowledge that our the people we replace have, and they pass on to us verbally or always kind of around in case you've got a question. And so, and you know, Kelly's done a lot over the years, even as a liaison with the federal government when there's sort of new policies or sort of things that they need to know about. He's sort of the go-to person. So that's a big thing in the background that we've lost by not having him and his staff there anymore. But sort of on the year-to-year work, they were pretty instrumental in many of the leaf diseases of barley that we care about, and scald was sort of their main bread and butter. They're in an ideal area of Western Canada to assess that disease, and it's not like we can assess scald in any kind of reliable way in Saskatchewan or Manitoba. It's very much something that shows up consistently in a real way in Alberta. So we've sort of lost that field capacity there, and then they were also doing net blotch as well, both spot form and net form. So both those diseases, we don't have another field nursery right now. So we have some indoor screening, but it's always nice to kind of see how these lines do in the field. So we've lost that. And then Kelly, along with like Randy Kutcher here at the university, was working on bacterial leaf streak. So starting to do some initial work on that. And you know, with Kelly and Randy also soon retiring here, we were kind of losing that capacity to look at a disease that sort of, at least in Kelly's mind, was sort of an upcoming one here that was something that we should be keeping an eye on. So I would say those are all gaps because we don't really have people able to kind of just step in right away and sort of run a field nursery for those diseases. I think even the WCI program, who has a pathologist who also does some scald work, I think he actually relied quite a bit on the facilities that Lacombe had. So even though he's still there as a pathologist, he doesn't really have the facilities anymore to do work in. So I think, yeah, like this year, you know, we've been able to kind of have sort of one last summer of disease assessment before these places officially shut down. But next year this winter is when we'll really have to sort of figure things out. But there's really only so much figuring we can do. It's not like, you know, right, we're going to pop a pathologist into place who's going to be functional within a year here. So that's probably, it's going to be a few years before we potentially get back to sort of a full running capacity in barley here.
One last summer of disease assessment. That's where the system sits right now. Scald screening, gone. Net blotch field nurseries, gone. Bacterial leaf streak capacity, just in the process of scaling up a nursery to address an emerging disease just before the closure, gone. And the institutional knowledge that Kelly Turkington and his technical staff held, the kind that doesn't transfer into a document or a database, gone along with them. Randy's call to SaskBarley and to the broader industry to challenge the powers that be is clear. And this isn't where the story ends. You'll hear more about the industry response in an upcoming bonus episode this season. For now, let's zoom out even further, because the closures are a crisis for the current system. What about the work that was already happening upstream of that system, the work designed to build disease resistance 15 or 20 years from now? Dr. Gurcharn Brar at the University of Alberta works upstream, an area we haven't been discussing with anyone else in this episode. In episode 7 of this season, Brar was discussing his work screening wild barley germplasm for resistance to scald and net blotch, diseases that currently have insufficient resistance in many commercial varieties. Today we're zooming out to the full scale of that work, a project that involves characterizing 20,000 barley accessions from a global gene bank and passing the most promising genetic material to breeders like Aaron Beattie and Anna Badia at AFC Brandon. Brar calls it pre-breeding. It's the work that happens before conventional breeding can even begin, identifying useful traits in wild or unimproved material, moving those traits into something that behaves enough like barley to be workable, and then passing it forward. He's been candid about the timeline.
So we have this Canadian plant gene bank in Saskatoon, which is best known for its barley collection. They have over 40,000 barley accessions, and we decided to do, molecular fingerprinting of 20,000 of the barleys and merge that data with publicly available data from global gene banks and, generate a resource, genomic resource, and identify some novel accessions that could be used for further studies on trait identification and marker development. We breeders, whenever we try to hunt for resistance, we first start with the elite material. And usually we don't find enough variation in elite material. Then we go to land races and then wild ancestors. So that's why we call it, pre-breeding. Basically, you are trying to fill the gap where you do this genetics and pre-breeding work, which is a lot of donkey work actually, because you have to deal with some weird-looking plants which are very late, very tall. You do not get enough seed, all type of problems, shattering. But once you move a trait of interest in elite material that looks like a normal plant, a normal variety, then that could be used by breeders to make a cross. So it's not always easy. But again, I think, like you said, we have to have a longer vision and have to look 20 years down the road. And if we are investing efforts and resources now, I'm sure we will make some genetic gains for disease resistance and other traits in 15, 20 years from now.
Yeah, so this is an area where we'd call upstream research. It's foundational work that needs to be done for further down the line.
Absolutely, yes.
20 years. That's what Gurcharn Brar is working toward. Not because the science is slow, because that's how long it takes to move a resistance trait from a wild barley plant into a stable, commercially viable variety. And that clock started ticking the moment he collected that first seed. The markers and genomic resources he's passing to Beattie and Badia are the bridge between his work and theirs. And the CDC copper story, which Aaron Beattie is about to tell, is the proof that this pipeline actually works. The CDC copper story is the best example Aaron Beattie has of what Gurcharn Brar's pre-breeding pipeline looks like when it actually reaches the finish line.
Gurcharn Brar is doing some work on wild barley germplasm, and with the intent of sharing that pre-breeding material with yourself and Anna Badia. How long before a useful trait from that material would it take for it to realistically show up in a commercial variety?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's definitely takes a few cycles of breeding to get that. If we're talking about a very simple scenario where it's just a single gene that's responsible for whatever resistance, I would say 2 at a minimum, and probably more likely it's going to be 3. For example, like CDC copper, when it came through and was registered, it contained a novel scald resistance gene that came out of wild barley, so Hordeum spontaneum. And this was work that was done in New Zealand. So the pathologist there had assessed this wild barley, found some resistance. He had crossed it into, I think it was an Australian variety. So by the time we got that Australian variety with this unique resistance in it, so you could almost say that's round 1 there, a little bit of back crossing into a cultivated variety. And then we took that variety, we crossed it we selected something from that and then crossed it again. And then eventually some of the progeny there became, one of them became CDC copper. So that was 3 cycles of selection before it actually became a variety. So you're talking about 15 or more years, I would say, from when when that pathologist sort of got that interesting resistance into something cultivated there.
Yeah, long time.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that what you call linkage drag that's slowing that process down?
That's right. Yeah. So basically, that spontaneum line or whichever background that resistance comes out of, it's got a lot of genes in it, and or alleles of genes that we don't really have any value for us. So we need to get rid of them and sort of just bring in that one gene that we're interested in. So yeah, all that other material in the genome has to be removed or vetted. So that's essentially why it takes us so long.
Linkage drag is the genetic cost of borrowing from wild material. Wild barley didn't evolve to perform well in the Saskatchewan field. It evolved to survive in its own environment, with genetics suited to very different conditions. When a breeder reaches into that wild germplasm to pull out a useful resistance gene, they bring a lot of unwanted hitchhikers along with it. Stripping those out, generation by generation, while keeping the one thing actually desired, that's what takes 15 years. It's why the work Gurcharn Brar is doing right now with accessions collected today is already running behind the need. And it's also why Aaron Beatty's program doesn't wait for a disease to become a crisis before starting to breed for resistance against it. What would you say to a grower who will someday be growing a variety you're developing right now, work that they won't see, and it's for a problem that hasn't hit them yet?
Yeah, for sure. So this is something we get into with breeding, and sometimes it's hard to justify why you're doing it, but we do try to kind of think about stuff coming down the pipe that might be an issue, or so we were talking about bacterial leaf streak before. That's a good example of maybe, pathologists are starting to see a little bit more of it around. They're thinking maybe it could become more of a problem. So between the pathologists and the breeders, they sort of get on looking for resistance and incorporating it into their program. And then eventually that makes its way into the varieties. So, we talked about how long that can take. So the sooner we get on this, the better it is, because if it does blow up, if that disease does blow up into something relevant, then we're kind of already on it. And so a grower who might not be paying quite as much attention to those sorts of things suddenly hears one year that this is a big problem. It's maybe good for them to know that others are kind of trying to pay attention to this stuff a little bit more closely, because we know farmers can't spend all their time sort of poking around in the weeds about what's the next thing to worry about. So that's kind of our job. And so that variety that they may see come out in 10 years, it may have something in it that we were thinking about 15 years, 20 years ago, that's now finally made its way into the variety. And whether that disease is there or not by the time that variety comes out, not sure, but at least we know we've got that covered off in case it crops up.
Breeding for a problem that may never arrive. It's an investment that pays off. Breeders and pathologists understand the risks that these diseases present and how they can move regionally and globally. We hope that these devastating diseases don't come, but are also vigilant and preparing in case they do. It requires a long institutional view, pathologists alerting breeders, breeders starting crosses, pre-breeders feeding wild genetics into the pipeline, sustained over years through funding cycles, through government decisions about which research centers stay open. Gord Moellenbeck put it well when he reflected on how the disease landscape has changed in his own farming career. Gord has been farming in East-Central Saskatchewan for 4 decades. He's watched the disease landscape of his region change dramatically in that time. Are there problems or research questions from your experience on your farm that you don't hear from the researchers or scientific community that you think should be more top of mind?
Not really. I think they're pretty in tune with what the growers want and need in terms of leaf diseases, fusarium, dawn, all that stuff. It's a slow process getting these new varieties out and good varieties out. So we'll just have to be patient a little bit on what some of these new ones will perform like. And who knows, like 30 years ago, you never heard of fusarium or rarely heard of it. You know, it was an issue in southern Manitoba or some other area that no, that'll never happen here, and then all of a sudden it spreads. So maybe there's something coming up that we aren't planning for, and I guess we'll have to see. But for us, the fusarium dawn thing is probably the top of our list of things to keep in mind of and watch for.
30 years ago, fusarium was someone else's problem. Today, it's in Gord's field in wet years and the back of his mind every year. Whatever is coming next, bacterial leaf streak, a new rust race, something nobody has named yet, the system being described in this episode is what the industry relies on to see it coming early enough to do something about it. The system has some gaps in it, and two of the people who built significant parts of it are taking well-earned retirements. Kelly Turkington did not plan to retire until December of 2028. The closure of the Lacombe Research Centre changed that. Randy Kutcher is transitioning to half-time at the University of Saskatchewan with retirement on the horizon and is actively looking to overlap with whoever takes over his pathology program. 2 careers, decades of nurseries, field surveys, grant applications, early mornings and plots. We asked both of them at the end of the respective interviews what they'd carry with them.
I'm actually heading into retirement, with the closure of the Lacombe Research Centre, the announcement in late January. I looked at some personal circumstances as well as work circumstances and decided it was probably time to leave. I hadn't planned on retiring until probably about December 2028, but plans have changed. So, yeah, so it's been the last couple weeks have been a lot of reminiscing and looking back at things and really valuing the impact that our program has had, and the success of our program is really due to the technical staff that I work with. So currently that's Jackie Busan and Sasha Chisholm, previously Noreen Rahala, Deb Clark, Denise Orr. So just a great group of people that I've had the opportunity to work with. So so we're transitioning into retirement. I've got a granddaughter and a grandson who's on the way. So yeah, those 2 individuals will probably take up a lot of my time.
When I think of your career, right, the interactions you and I have had over the years, the ones that stand out to me is your kind of groundbreaking work in bacterial leaf streak. But what stands out for you as your career is moving to that next phase where you're moving to halftime soon and looking at retirement within a couple of years? What of the research you've done really jumps out at you?
Well, the research for sure. I mean, when I was a canola person, for the most part, at the first number of years, blackleg was one of my big issues. But I think more than just the research, it's the people, right? It's the people you work with, the times you and I had to spend together and learn from each other. And I'm going to really miss that. I mean, I'm sure I'll have different experiences in retirement, but working with the grower groups up in Melford, working with the staff at Melford and Ag Canada period, working with my colleagues at other Ag Canada stations. We used to have a pretty good agronomy group. We would meet once a year, talk about issues, talk about research that needed to be done. That was so helpful at the beginning of my career, because you get a PhD, but you really don't know a whole heck of a lot, right? It's the experience that you develop by working with colleagues, by working with farmers, by working with groups like yours, Mitchell, SaskWheat, SaskBarley, WGRF, all the groups that, the growers know what the priorities are, and hopefully we can work together to address them. And then the big thing here at the university has been the students. It's been so much fun. I didn't think about it. I was more worried about teaching. I was fairly comfortable talking to growers and talking to agronomists when I worked at Ag Canada, but teaching's a little different. It's interesting in its own way. So I really enjoyed that a lot.
On behalf of SaskBarley, and I think it's fair to say for the barley producers across the prairies who have benefited from their work, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Randy. Your work has mattered. Here's the chain that generates a disease resistance rating in your seed guide. A pathologist in New Zealand identifies resistance in a wild barley plant they had access to. That material passes to a breeder in Australia, and then to a program in Saskatchewan. Through 3 cycles of crosses and selection over 15 years, and eventually becomes CDC copper, a variety with a novel scald resistance gene that no cultivated barley in Canada had before it. Meanwhile, Gurcharn Brar is characterizing 20,000 accessions from a global gene bank, looking for the resistance traits that will feed the varieties of the 2040s. Aaron Beattie is running 40,000 lines through a funnel that produces 800 candidates for replicated yield testing, each of them assessed for disease resistance across multiple years and locations. Disease nurseries at Lacombe and Indian Head and Brandon run year after year, generating the data that feeds the Prairie Recommending Committee for Oat and Barley Disease Evaluation Team, that grumpiest committee, as Aaron put it, which decide on what the seed guide rating is. And Gord Moellenbeck opens that guide every spring, and he looks at the MR next to AZ Connect and makes a decision that affects every acre he plants. That chain is under pressure right now. Lacombe is closing, Indian Head's closing. Kelly Turkington retired years before he planned to. Randy Kutcher is transitioning out. The disease nursery capacity for scald, net blotch, and the emerging bacterial leaf streak threat has been disrupted. There will be more on that in an upcoming bonus episode this season, where we'll hear directly from SaskBarley about what the industry is doing in response, and what it needs from the federal government. For now, if you grow barley, your crops have benefited from this system. The MR or MS or R you read in the seed guide is the output of years of work by people like the ones you've heard from today. The varieties that will protect your fields from diseases that don't exist yet in your region or haven't peaked yet are being worked on right now in a nursery somewhere on the prairies or in a growth chamber or in a gene bank database with 20,000 entries. It's a long game, and the people playing it, they deserve a little recognition. Thank you, Gord Moellenbeck, Dr. Kelly Turkington, Dr. Randy Kutcher, Dr. Gurcharn Brar, and Dr. Aaron Beattie for their time and candor this season. We'll see you in the bonus episode. I'm Mitchell Japp.
Thanks for listening to the Barley Bin. Rate our podcast, subscribe, and tell a friend to tune in wherever you listen to podcasts. Brought to you by SaskBarley, because it's time to get in the bin and get itchy.
Produced at
Sound Lounge by T-Bone.